So earlier we talked about um, kind of how you respectfully and creatively told to tell this or decided to tell this tale so that people weren't uncomfortable, so that it was kind of showing more of the overreaching how it happened and how nobody knew part of the story. And I'm wondering, it's really stylized and it's almost like a heightened reality. And I'm wondering how you chose that particular direction.
Well, I think it's a balance. We didn't want it to feel so stylized or heightened that it felt like an unrecognizable world. We did want to capture the era and use some cinematic techniques from the era without it feeling like caricature or pastiche. And the characters, the people, we have so much of their real dialogue and so much of the recorded phone conversations and transcripts. And one of the challenges was kind of capturing the reality without making it feel like we were doing a Fargo or something like aw shucks or whatever. I mean, but in the phone conversations, they actually do say like, oh, fiddle, and I mean, these are real things. So we both depended a lot on the actors and on the directors and everybody kind of capturing this feeling of this 1972 to 1978 without making it feel like we were keeping it at arm's length. I don't know if that answered your question. You were talking about the cinematic style, but
Yes, yes.
we also wanted to evolve the style as the story evolved and as the characters' understanding of what was happening to them deepened, and to kind of modernize the cinematic techniques just a little bit as we went from 1972 to 1978. So what we see in episodes 1 and episode 3, which are before the kidnapping and before the nightmare kind of really starts, at least in the awareness of the characters, it's a more nostalgic feeling. It's a little bit more sepia. It's a little bit more at a distance. And then as we go further, the shadows deepen, the shots deepen. There's kind of more overt complexity in the compositions and a little more movement. And so all of that was something that we talked about from the beginning, the style evolving.
Yeah, it really worked. I like it a lot.
I'm glad. Thank you.
And I'm wondering, you've previously explored like family dynamics and kind of how odd things can happen within a family in the act. Um, how did you determine that this story was right for that same kind of fictionalized treatment?
It's not an algorithm. It's just, is it an itch that you can't stop scratching, I guess. From a writer point of view, I'm not looking for more true crime stories to tell. I'm telling true stories or being part of telling them when they are deeply compelling from a human sense, and when they're a story that I would be gripped by and a story that I'm really curious about. I guess it begins with curiosity. And I may have mentioned this, when we talked before, but I've found, if I try and think about what are the things that make me really want to be part of telling a true story, it's if I can bring a meaningful look at how something happened and how it felt while it was happening, what it felt like to live through it. In addition to it being an entertaining and gripping story, because you have to do that.
Sure, sure. Earlier this year, FX also aired Under the Banner of Heaven, which is another kind of crazy, dynamic, real story that's kind of getting this same treatment. and it's also involving the Mormon religion. And I'm wondering, do you see any parallels between the shows and how the families kind of ended up where they did? Do you think there's any religious aspect to how perhaps these stories came to be?
I
Yeah.
can't speak to parallels with Under the Banner of Heaven because I haven't seen it yet. I'm
Oh, okay.
very behind on my TV watching because I spent the past year in Atlanta, basically, and in working on, on these shows. But I did read the book many years ago when it came out and thought it was a really powerfully written book. I have no idea about the series, because I haven't seen it. I do think that the the Mormonism is an interesting aspect of it, but I want to be very careful about being respectful of
Sure.
religion and the faith, because I think that what's really interesting about the role of Mormonism in the story is how Birchtold took really specific things from it and saw the groundwork that had already been laid in terms of beliefs that he could manipulate, right? So
Right.
if you've been hearing the word mission for all your life, and mission is like a normal thing that everybody does, and people like, then taking the idea of aliens that the kids have been sort of indoctrinated with, because it's all over the news, it's in all the stuff they're watching, and there's reports of people seeing aliens and UFOs all the time in the papers, and saying aliens have kidnapped you and they've given you a mission, and tying in so much of the imagery that she's heard at church about angels, people from other worlds. They're here, they've given you a mission. It just it's a lot of tools for him to use that are already there. And that's not to say that it's the church's fault at all. It's just
Right.
really interesting to be aware of what he had at his disposal.
Well, and by the same token, he used he used everything that they hold dear, the way that they embrace their neighbors and the way they embrace their fellow Mormons and in that community, and how it was so close, and he just took it and
Well, if
manipulated everybody.
the values of the community and of the religion are faith, family, forgiveness, and there's no concept of pedophilia being, an incurable condition that an adult man can have. Like, they just don't know that. So this notion that, he's got manic depression, and he's really just infatuated with their daughter because of his own childhood, which was so difficult. And while during a manic depressive episode, he made a terrible error of judgment, and then he couldn't come back, and it just got deeper and deeper. And, they're supposed to forgive him, and he's their brother. Like, all these things are such a huge part of why they made the decisions that seem to us like, what were they thinking?
Right. And you mentioned about the pedophilia, that scene where it kind of comes to light that there's this thing, the looks on everybody's faces, it just really played well, because they were just absolutely incredulous. Is this a real thing? And what did he say? What did Colin Hanks' character say?
Is it a medical condition?
Yeah, is it a medical condition? It's beyond understanding.
Right. And then, of course, he's got these other medical conditions. Maybe that's but what does this really mean? And the idea that, well, if it's a medical condition, then there must be a treatment, and that's a thing that can be cured. And like, it's not, even when they hear what the FBI agent says to them, and the FBI agent is kind of learning about himself, they're not going, oh my God, that means he wants to sexually assault our daughter. That still is not entering their brains. Right.
And I have to ask, what is it like working with Jan, who, of course, is at the heart of this story, this terrible story, and yet she is the ultimate survivor. she is successful and has just turned any idea that your life has to fall apart on its head.
Working with Jen is a really meaningful experience. I mean, I think that probably goes without saying, but it from a creative standpoint, to have such a extraordinary resource and who is so giving and so generous and just gave us so much that you could never make up, you could never invent, and it was a unique experience and really special. And then just on a human level, to be working with the person who it happened to, and she is so generous and so strong. It meant a lot, not just to me, it meant a lot to everybody, I think, who was kind of putting themselves out there to play a role or any of the creatives. It was very meaningful.
And my last question for you is, what else would you like the audience to know before they start watching? What do you think is important for them to know about this?
That's a good question. Well, I think it's important for them to know that Jan is involved. And I think telling this story, we assumed that many viewers would come in already kind of knowing all the big beats of the story. So I would say, I hope that people will come in with open minds, withholding their judgment, or the judgments they may have having heard the story before, and try and experience it through the eyes of people who are in the early 70s in a very conservative community, who have been taught the principles of faith, family, forgiveness, and don't know the things that we know now. I think that's very important. And another thing that we told everybody who's working on the show, and that we made a decision very early, is that even though the show deals with very painful themes and intense subject matter, you're not going to be seeing anything on screen that you can't watch. We made a very conscious decision early on that it's not going to be explicit, it's not going to be exploitative. We're never going to ask actors to do anything that they might be uncomfortable with. And it truly is about the psychological and emotional experience of living through this surreal ordeal for 6 years and a family getting through it and overcoming something.
Well, I think you managed to do that well too. From the first episode on, that it's not going to be salacious. I
hope so. I'm glad.
It's so much more than that, but it's almost worse to see how innocent everybody was, and to see they're just walking without having a clue where it was going to end up. It's really painful to see such beautiful, happy people on this path.
I'm glad you say that. I mean, watching it, I've seen it so many times in so many different versions as we cut and did post, but watching it in a theater, in a screening with Jan and a few other people the first time, I was white knuckling it. I was very stressed out, and not just because I was nervous about people seeing it, but I was able to see the story with fresh eyes after working on it for so long. I was like, oh God, no, don't let her go. Don't let her go.
I know, really. And you captured the era very well. I'm just a little bit younger than Jan, and
I'm glad to hear that.
That's exactly how it was. I mean, it was like standing in my old living room.
I'm glad to hear that. Hear that. We recreated their house almost exactly. We took a real house and totally gutted it, renovated it, made it nearly identical as we could.
I had no idea you went to that degree. What else what else went to that degree, set wise? And
that was the most important thing, because we were going to be living in it. And, that makes it hard to shooting because there's tight little corridors and everything. Sure. Normally you would design a house or a set in a way like, okay, this hallway is going to be wider and we're going to do this and we're going to do that so that the cameras can go this way and there's ways for crew to get in. It was a challenge to shoot on it because it was laid out like a real house without all the sort of normal tricks that you would use building a set. Yeah, I mean, most of it, like anything we had pictures of, we tried to recreate pretty closely.
And filming it that way, I think maybe is why it felt so personal.
I'm glad.
You know,
Yeah.
instead of, it didn't feel like you were on a set, it did feel like you were in a home. Wow. Thank you so much again for taking this extra time with me. It was just a very special and
thank you. Yeah, no, I know that you've
very
written about
special.
previous shows and I've read your stuff about our stuff in the past. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet. You bet. Thanks so much, Nick. Have a good evening.
You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.